Welcome to PCA Distance Learning. This is American History, Chapter 27, A World Conflict. We're looking at World War II. And this lesson is entitled The End of the Beginning. And what we want to see here as a big picture is the transition from the Axis victories of 39, 40, 41, 42 to the Allied victories of 42, 43, 44, and 45. The big picture, this is the turn of the tide. All right, let's take a look at some of the specific places where the Allies begin to gain advantage over the Axis nations. It starts with the Battle of the Atlantic. And for both Roosevelt and Churchill, this was a very key step toward ultimate victory. They had decided the Allied priority back in August of 1941, before the U.S. had even entered the war, would be Germany first. That it was important to attack German strength as the most feared of the various Axis nations. And it was particularly important to make sure that Britain stayed in the war. And secondarily, to make sure the Soviet Union stayed in the war. So the immediate problem for the Western Allies, Canada, the United States, and Britain, was control of the North Atlantic, the line of communication between Britain and the New World. Now, the various South American nations, the Latin American republics, are going to provide a little bit of help here. 21 nations agreed to break relations with the Axis powers as of January 1942. So the Latin American republics will pretty well take care of the South Atlantic. The North Atlantic is going to be the UK, Britain, and the United States. All right, want to understand that the Germans are better at submarine warfare than they were in the First World War. They have a number of advantages. By 44, they introduce the snorkel tube, which means that a submarine can stay submerged but continue to run its diesel engines and not switch over to batteries. The exhaust pipe goes down, comes out one section of the snorkel tube, and fresh air enters another section of the snorkel tube. And so submarines operating close to the surface but below the surface do not need to engage their battery packs, which would slow them down and eventually wear down. Torpedoes have longer range and greater hitting power. And one of the great advances of World War II from the Germans is the idea of Wolfpack tactics. They'll put their submarines in a line, north to south, in the Atlantic when one of the submarines contacts a convoy. It will radio German naval headquarters in the rear. Naval headquarters will then send messages out to all other submarines, and they can converge on that convoy. So there could be 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 U-boats hitting the same convoy at the same time. The preferred method for the Germans was surface attack at night. And the net result for them appears to be very good. As we get to 1942, they are sinking hundreds of tons of shipping per month. In May of 42, it will be 120 ships. And all told, they will sink about 2,500 Allied ships at nearly 13 million tons of cargo haulage capacity. In the summer of 42, sinking is rising from month to month. August of 42, 660,000 tons. In September, again, down a very little bit, 570,000 tons. October, it's back up 640,000 tons. In this window, the Germans are sinking about 1/3 more than the Allies are producing. Every month, the Allied shipping capacity drops. And ultimately, the Germans will be able to attack about 650 different convoys during the war. Now, the Allies will get better at convoy escorts. They will move to convoy earlier in the war than they did in World War II. They remembered the lesson. They provided stronger escorts, more destroyers, destroyer escorts, and corvettes, the smaller three classes of ships that collectively made up the anti-submarine warfare vessels. They used depth charges to attack the submarines below the surface, and the Allies will develop a Hedgehog launcher that will fire 24 depth charges simultaneously. So you have 12 of them going in each direction off the rear end of the ship, each of them set at different depths, and they are far more dangerous to a submarine than individual depth charges being rolled off the back end. In terms of technology, the Allies will use sonar, which is an underwater version of radar. Radio direction finding. They're not cracking the German codes in real time, but they can tell the location from which a submarine radios a message. They will use land-based long-range bombers. And unfortunately, as they put them around the North Atlantic, there's a gap in the middle, sometimes called the Greenland Gap, or sometimes, more derisively, Torpedo Junction. This is where the submarines concentrated because they knew they couldn't be spotted from the air. And a very key step here will be the development of what were called escort carriers, sometimes baby flat tops or jeep carriers. They weren't nearly as big as the fleet carriers used in the Pacific that might carry 75 to 90 combat aircraft. They might only have 20 or 25 aircraft. But even the smaller size carrier could maintain a combat air patrol over the top of a convoy as long as it was light out, and hence force German submarines to do all their work below the surface, where they were both much slower and had a tougher time acquiring visibility of convoys. If we look at some numbers here, we are going to see that the Germans peaked in their ship sinking of the Allies in 1942. In 1939, they sank 165, or at least hit 165 ships. In 1940, 563 Allied ships hit. In 1941, 501 Allied ships. 1942, the maximum total, 1,322 Allied ships hit by U-boat. Now, what happens thereafter? 43, 582. We're back to the level of 40-41. 1944, 243 ships. We are half the previous total. And in 1945, 98 ships. The U-boats are almost not a factor by the end of the war. Now, why is that? Well, we can compare that to the number of German submarines sunk. 1939, 9 subs. 1940, 22 subs. 1941, 35 subs. 1942, 85 subs. And then we'll see the big jump in 1943. 287 German submarines sunk. 1944, again, a very high 241 submarines sunk. And in 1945, 153 submarines sunk. There are a lot less submarines out there doing a lot less damage by the end of the war. The Atlantic is basically an Allied lake by 1945. All right, let's shift to land warfare in North Africa. The British hold a position based on Gibraltar at the south of Spain and the Suez in Egypt. Desert warfare is something like a spring. Each side has bases, and as it advances from the base, it gets increasingly less powerful. Conversely, a nation that is forced to retreat toward its base gets increasingly strong. The initial warfare in 1941 saw the British 8th Army defeating a number of Italian units. Hitler got embarrassed at the Axis defeat, and he sent a German contingent to join the Allies in North Africa. This would be called the Afrika Korps, Corps with a K. And this force will be led by General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. This is a mixed German-Italian unit, and Rommel will eventually earn promotion up to the grade of Field Marshal. The Afrika Korps will defeat the British at Benghazi in January of 42, and it appears for a minute that they might be able to drive across Egypt and reach the oil fields of the Middle East. The British fell back outside Alexandria to Alam Halfa, about a 70-mile buffer that they had before they were losing a key city. And Churchill would select General Montgomery to be the new British commander, often simply called Monty. Rommel planned a right hook attack at the British defense at Alam Halfa. The British are able to read via ultra intercepts what it is that Rommel intends to do, and Monty is able to hold his ground successfully. Monty will then attack the Germans in turn near the village of El Alamein. And after about 12 days, he will achieve breakthrough. The Germans are going to be forced to abandon their positions and to retreat rapidly all the way past the Egyptian border and back into Tunisia. Rommel is forced on a very long retreat. He will lose 500 tanks, 400 artillery pieces, 60,000 men, which seems an enormous number until you realize that most of them were Italian infantry that didn't have vehicles and couldn't possibly keep up with a motorized convoy by retreating on foot. Now, while the British are beating Rommel in the eastern desert, we are going to see an Allied landing in the western desert at a number of separated cities, Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. Collectively, these will be called Operation Torch. Most of these forces will be British. They were more combat ready. The overall commander will be an American, and that will be General Dwight Eisenhower. The locations for the torch landings have a couple of advantages. They are relatively accessible to the Allied navies, and most importantly, they're a fairly long way away from most of the German ground forces. The Vichy French government will provide the initial response, and they are badly divided. Many of the French believe they should be part of the Allies, not the Axis powers, and they do not make a very powerful response here to the Allied landing. The Germans will fall back across Algeria to concentrate in Tunisia, where they can connect with Rommel and the Afrika Korps. The first German attack against American forces advancing into Tunisia will be embarrassing. It will be a major defeat for the American forces. We will fire Major General Lloyd Friedendahl from U.S. Second Corps, and we will appoint a new commander, Major General George S. Patton, and we'll certainly hear about him again in the future. All right, so the Allies have successfully cleared out Egypt, have successfully taken Algeria and Tunisia, and have squeezed the Germans into a narrow box on the Tunisian coast. So, victory in the Atlantic, victory in North Africa. Let's take a look at the Eastern Front. In the winter of 1941, the Soviet Union had regained a substantial amount of the ground lost in warmer weather. As the winter passed, the snow melted, the ground firmed up, the Nazis regained the initiative, and they drove south through Ukraine and Russia toward the oil fields in and around Baku. Initially, this German advance went very, very well, and they reached the Russian city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. Now, the Russians were very determined to hold the city named for Stalin, and they will defend this city street by street, block by block, in some cases room by room. And the Germans got a little fixated on this city, and they brought more and more of their forces in to try to clear out the very small sized Soviet remnant holding Stalingrad. Now, the problem as the Germans did this is that their flanks north and south of the city along the Volga River were supported not by German forces, but by satellite troops, Romanian troops, Hungarian troops, even a Spanish division. And these were not strong forces. They were not as good man for man as either the Germans or the Soviets. Obviously, it's going to get cold as we move from October into November. The Soviets will launch a major counterattack Operation Uranus. They will attack both north and south of the city of Stalingrad. They will form a very large circle around that city, and they will trap General von Paulus's 6th German Army, several 100,000 men cut off. Now, von Paulus gets on the radio, calls Berlin, explains the situation, asks for guidance, says that he feels he can break out of the trap if he moves quickly. Hitler consults his top aides, and Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, says, "Don't worry about it. We can provide supply by air." So Hitler orders von Paulus to hold his ground, and that the Germans would be able to drop in food and ammo and fuel. And those deliveries end up far smaller than von Paulus's 6th Army requires. Ultimately, they're getting perhaps 10% of their minimum daily requirements. And somewhere about 130,000 of the men of the 6th Army will be shot or perish due to starvation or freezing to death, and the last 60-odd thousand will surrender at the very beginning of February 1943. And certainly Stalingrad is a major Soviet victory, a huge turning point on the Eastern Front. Now we move to the Pacific Theater. We see the Japanese advancing in the aftermath of their successful surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto will capture the tip of the Malayan Peninsula and the very important British base at Singapore. He will attack the American holdings in the Philippines. The U.S. forces will retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, and many of them, when they surrender to Japanese forces there, will be forced on a very difficult march through heat. And this was a group of men that had been on a third to a quarter rations for a period of months, so they were very weakened, many of them suffering from disease. And marching in that weakened state without food over extended distances, without sufficient water, a very large number of both Filipinos and Americans will die in what becomes known as the Bataan Death March. The Allies hold a couple major anchors in the Pacific Theater: Hawaii, the major U.S. Navy base, and Australia is where Allied forces begin to gather to prepare to attack north against the Japanese. And General Douglas MacArthur will be evacuated by submarine out of the Philippines and take charge when he reaches Australia. Excuse me, please, sorry. He rather famously announces, "I shall return," as he returns to Australia, and he means that he will return also back to the Philippines. Very quickly, we see the desire for an Allied offensive against the Japanese. We'll see a small air force operating in China under U.S. Commander Claire Chennault. His Flying Tigers will shoot down hundreds of Japanese planes. Brigadier General Jimmy Doolittle will organize a raid on Tokyo in April of 1942. This is not Dr. Doolittle, so we're not using rhinos in the attack here. Brigadier General Doolittle will figure out a way to launch Army B-25 bombers off of Navy aircraft carriers, the Hornet and the Enterprise. And these planes are able to reach and bomb Tokyo. Now, the damage inflicted there is clearly on the minimal side. But at the same time, this is the first major Allied strike against the Japanese, and it proved that their defenses were not invulnerable. Now we come to the significant Battle of the Coral Sea, which will take place in the first week of May in 1942. The Japanese launch an invasion force toward Port Moresby, northeast of Australia. The U.S. sends out the aircraft carriers Lexington and Yorktown. And our two carriers against three Japanese carriers. This is the first battle in history where surface ships do not exchange a single shot. All of the action will be attack aircraft coming off of carriers against opposing fleets. We will lose the Lexington, as well as a destroyer and a tanker and a number of aircraft. Tactically, this is a defeat because we suffer more losses of men and equipment. At the same time, strategically, it's an Allied victory. The Japanese plan to invade the northern portion of New Guinea off of Australia around Port Moresby. That never happens, and they do lose an aircraft carrier as well. All right, let's take a look at a very important successor battle about a month after Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway. And this is known as one of the more decisive battles of World War II. Japanese Navy under Admiral Yamamoto plans to attack Midway as a step toward eliminating the Allied naval base at Pearl Harbor. And his view is that the U.S. Navy has already lost many of its battleships. Its primary striking force is now aircraft carriers, and he believes he can force them to either give up Midway, at which point he can destroy our base at Pearl Harbor, or to fight outnumbered at Midway, and he hopes to inflict a crushing blow on the Navy there. Admiral Nimitz, as the commander of the Navy in the Pacific, has 3 aircraft carriers left, the Yorktown, the Enterprise, and the Hornet, and they will be deployed to defend Midway. A key factor here will be our ability to read Japanese encoded message traffic and gain what is magic information, the equivalent of the ultra information that the British are gaining against the Germans. In a pitched air-sea battle, the Americans will lose an aircraft carrier, the Yorktown, a destroyer, 150 planes, and over 300 lives. The torpedo squadron off of the Hornet will come in to attack at very low levels, and the Japanese Combat Air Patrol will shoot down every single plane in that torpedo squadron. One single man would be rescued from the attack. But in the process of stopping those torpedo bombers, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol all came down to sea level. There was nothing left at altitude. and then our dive bomber squadrons reached the Japanese aircraft carriers and had a free window of attack. By the time this battle is over, the Japanese will lose 4 aircraft carriers, as well as a couple of heavy cruisers and some destroyers, and nearly 300 aircraft with their trained crews. And this is a decisive defeat for the Japanese advance eastward across the Pacific. Really, for the rest of the war, the Americans will be driving west toward Japan. Battle of Midway here, a huge turnaround in favor of the Allies. Now, while that's happening, to the southwest will be the Battle of Guadalcanal that will take place in the Solomon Island chain. This will start in August of 42. It will end in February of 43. So the dates there are almost exactly the dates of Stalingrad. The Japanese are looking to interrupt Allied supply operations coming out of Hawaii and proceeding down to Australia. They don't have the aircraft carriers to do that anymore after Midway. So their thought is to use land-based air power. They picked the Solomon Islands as squarely astride the Allied line of communication, and they go in there and start building air bases on Guadalcanal. The American 1st Marine Division under Major General Vandegrift will land on Guadalcanal, will seize the Japanese air base. They'll finish it. They'll name it Henderson Field. And then they will end up absorbing 3 increasingly large Japanese attacks. While the Japanese are putting in these ground-based attacks, we'll see a series of 5 or 6 naval battles where the Navy will protect the Solomon Islands. And the big picture in those attacks is that by and large, the Japanese Navy is much better trained at nighttime operations. And the U.S. ends up having a technological advantage with radar, especially useful in daylight operations, so that we have a pattern of alternating attacks, the U.S. by day, the Japanese by night. And in the end, the naval battles are roughly a wash. Both sides lose roughly the same equivalent. It's going to be determined by the battles on land. And we're going to see the Japanese put 3 different attacking forces against Henderson Field. And they will lose first a regiment, and then a substantial portion of a brigade, and finally much of a field army will be sent in to attack. All of those attacks will be unsuccessful on Guadalcanal. And we're going to see a number of positive consequences for the Allies from the fighting here in the Solomon Islands and on Guadalcanal in particular. First of all, the lines of communication are held. Supplies continue to flow. The Japanese don't get to interrupt that flow. And now with the new air base, supply lines are even more secure than they had been before. Secondly, there's a psychological impact. The Japanese had not lost a battle on land to the Allied forces. They hadn't lost territory. They hadn't been knocked backwards. And now their uninterrupted flow of success has been punctured. They've lost. They no longer have the psychological edge that they had held before. There's a third useful piece here, and that is the lessons learned in jungle warfare, which is not something that the Marine Corps was particularly expert in before World War II. The 1st Marine Division learns a lot of lessons about operating in a jungle. And Uncle Sam's Misguided Children, USMC, right, the Marines, are particularly good at communicating to other Marines. What the 1st Marines learns here will be spread throughout the Corps rather effectively and applied in other battlefields on other occasions over the next couple of years. So after holding our supply lines solidly at Guadalcanal, we start to push across New Guinea from Port Moresby up over the Kokoda Trail into the Owen Stanley Range and begin the long, difficult process of pushing Japan off of New Guinea. Allied leaders will meet in Casablanca in January of 1943. That would be in the coast of Morocco. They begin to plan future operations, looking at a potential invasion from North Africa into Sicily and Italy. And this will set up a number of future conferences that will be continued through much of the war in Tehran and famously at Yalta. Winston Churchill reviewed the events of 1942 and early 43. And his judgment was this: this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning. That wave of Allied defeats had stopped. The Allies had started to win. The Allies had picked up momentum. And for the rest of the war, the Axis powers would in general be on the defensive and be retreating. Have a great day. Go forth, do great and wonderful things. God bless.